A very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for sharing your afternoon with us. And let's start. It's quite an interesting picture, isn't it? Especially thrilling when one realizes that this is a visual composite of assembled data from thousands of commercial ships. So the white lines that outline the countries are actually visuals of maritime navigation. This is as good an entrance as any to start our story about ruling the waters. Rain. Thank you to the Women's Athletic Club for hosting this series on water. And the motivation for this series is to emphasize the centrality of water to human history. September's preamble painted the picture of omnipresence with the profound impact of water in governance, development, economics, the arts, international relationships, to name a few. And the daunting vastness of this subject will be viewed for this series through the filters of environment, economics, and ethics. The Nourishment Project is about joyous curiosity and being part of something much larger than ourselves. Here are some of the references that inform this presentation. A special thanks to our curriculum collaborator, the Oriental Institute. It's a pleasure to work with Dr. Vorderstrasse, and water has inspired many ideas of mastery, the discovery of new lands from the Greeks right up to Leonardo DiCaprio in that Titanic movie, I'm king of the world. It didn't really work out well for him, but I thought that was a nice way to transition to another shipwreck like the Titanic, this is a very old one, an ancient one, which is a recent discovery around 2014. It's called the Godavaya. It's in the Indian Ocean by Ceylon, and it is still in the initial stages of excavation, and most likely the oldest known shipwreck in the Indian Ocean. So the ship was transporting a cargo of raw materials, including what appears to be ingots of iron and glass, as well as finished ceramic bowls and stone querns. Querns are mills for grinding. These waters of the Indian Oceans were and still remain very busy channels, just as they used to be during the Roman times and prior to the Romans, as evidenced in this periplus. So the periplus or periplus, you can say it either way, is a manuscript document that lists the ports and coastal landmarks that the captain of a vessel could expect to find along a shore. This is a Greco-Roman periplus describing the navigation and trading opportunities from Roman Egyptian ports. This one documents the commercial trade between India and Roman Italy in the 1st century CE, which is current era. Pearls and spices from the East were coveted items by the Romans. And it's been underlined by the red mark. These ancient sites, Khor, Rori, and Mliha, have been evacuated. In Mliha, what is now Arabia, what was found is a handi, which is the Indian term for a cooking vessel. You will see this in India, still used now anywhere you go in the village. It's a very common cooking vessel in India. So this had been discovered. And also from the other site that had been marked on the map, Khor Rorish, we discovered lead coins from India that dates from around the 1st or the 2nd century CE. CE is current era. And this looks like chicken scratch, but it's not. It's how they copy what used to be found in the excavation. And nature plays a vital role in all of this. And nature includes obviously water, not just for providing the materials for the pots and the coins, and nor for the waterways that transported the traders, but nature in the form of wind, because the winds were crucial for these navigation. I'm going to point because this looks like a busy map. So here is India. If you follow my cursor, there is India, there is Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, the Persian Gulf right there, and these areas would be Somalia. So this detailed list, as one can see here, that was on the periplus on the top right there. To navigate through here, they would have to know the winds. It was essential for that. And these periplus that we were seeing before, it suggested a great interest in India. So they would have to know how to navigate the Indian Ocean. Most ships that went to India returned the following spring during the northeast monsoon in the Arabian Sea. Nature dictated the schedule, hence the term trade winds. So late spring, early summer was the main time to travel. Winds traveled southwest during the summer, and ships bound for Africa had different monsoons and returned around November or December, a year and a half since when they had left their original ports. The term monsoon is the prevailing wind in the South and Southeast Asian regions. So torrential rain is what the term monsoon brings to my mind. And etymologically, monsoon comes from the Arabic mausim, which in Hindi, which is an Indian language, is mausam, effectively means season. So mausam is what eventually becomes monsoon. So right below Korori and Mliha, I'm going to point now, here is this little white dot. As written next to it is that island of Socotra. Brahmi coins, which come from India, and also shards of cooking pots had been found on this island. And I wonder, what did those Indian sailors in the 1st, 2nd century CE current era think when they encountered these Socotra's dragon blood trees for the first time? Can you imagine waiting out an entire year and a half while the winds get better so you can sail back home? And by home, I mean from Socotra here all the way back to India, about a 1,700-mile trip. That is like traveling from New York all the way to Little Rock, Arkansas, except that you might encounter sharks and you risk being capsized in this homebound journey. Roman evidence abounds in India. Coins being the most durable because textiles don't last. The humidity ruins textiles. Gold Roman coins found in India, the ones that are shown on the right, you will notice 2 holes in them. That's because Indians, even now, I am probably the exception, they love jewelry, and coins like this, gold coins, would have been strung with these holes so they could string it and wear it as a necklace. And even now, those who've been to India or those who might in the future, you will see nomadic men and women wear their wealth on them. That's how they carry their gold. It's their jewelry. Roman style gold coins were accepted in the Indian markets. So on the bottom, you can see the copies of the Roman coins made in India, and a big difference, and an important difference, is the difference in weight. So even though they look different, the weight is different. And these Indian minted coins were probably used for trade with the Romans when they came back, because India traded with the Romans with spice and silk and pearls. Apparently Julius Caesar loved pearls, so lots of trades going back. And there were also pearls in the Persian Gulf. We also have historically evidence of a certain Roman, an historian of rather uneven accuracy, because not all his tales are true. And these written on the side are his scathing views of some of these trades of the Silk routes. So in his book, Naturalis Historia, Pliny the Elder had documented his resentment of the extravagant sum, 10% of the Roman Empire budget, that was being spent for acquisition of luxury goods to, and I quote, enable the Roman lady to shimmer in public, close quotes. Effectively, Roman lady, and probably Roman men as well, like to shimmer in silk. So these were the times of the proverbial Silk Road. And the mere mentioning of the Silk Road conjures up exotic lands for many people. For me, it's much more than that, because the Silk Road series was the first series I'd ever started with the National Women's Athletic Club. Can you imagine 16 months ago in May 2020? It's hard to believe we've been through 16 presentations together. And I hope you've had as much fun learning as I have with you. The Nourishment Project is peer-to-peer learning, so none of this would be possible without you. And since Thanksgiving is right around the corner, please know I am so grateful that you share your time with us. So the Silk Roads are trade networks. They are land and sea routes that have fed and continue to feed our appetites for luxury and the exotic. And because it connects people, trade is an essential part of humanity because along with objects, ideas and perspectives are transported. So our world expands. And what was true 2,100 years ago continues to be true now. These routes, both land and sea, and what is not being showed digital, there's an entire digital Silk Road, are the new Silk Roads. It's a $1 trillion investment by China. And that is euphemism, that is also known as the Belt and Road Initiative. So here are the roads, and here is the proverbial belt gartering the entire globe. So the belts are the maritime routes. Many new ports are under construction globally, which is networking the entire world. And I suppose if you take it from the different perspective, the true meaning of Mediterranean, middle of the earth, synchronizes rather well with the Chinese Middle Kingdom perspective, except that the Chinese see the Middle Kingdom not vertically, not that there's someone above you. The view from them is a horizontal perspective. So the Middle Kingdom signifies that you are the central node of that web, the essential. So in that sense, China would be the essential of this new Belt and Road Initiative. It's really fascinating how it connects from what has been in the back even to now. And there's a nice symmetry. They're trying to have a court system like you have the Hague. They're trying to have a court system put for this trade network in Xi'an, because the original trade routes, I'm going to go back up one, it had started in the Xi'an region. So they really do pull in the history and honor heritage across the board. So the liquid pathway, water, which shapes us. Today's presentation, as evident in the writing, in the bright red, is economics. Reigning as an REIGNING through power, the power of wealth, hence economics. October's presentation, watercolors, had alluded to the environmental aspects because water, the color of water indicates levels of pollution, or it could also indicate levels of chemistry, as in the algae. And though admittedly, these Icelandic waters and their silts are watercolors in the aesthetic sense, just completely mesmerizing. It's like an absolute painting of nature. The colors on this map mesmerize due to the sheer amount of information displayed. So again, this is a chart of global shipping routes. Each year, more than 11 billion tons of products get carried around the world by large ships. So everything from clothes and flat screen TVs, grains, cars, oil, transporting those goods from port to port is really what makes our global economy go around. And so the colors, these route colors, reflect the economic model. So for example, the yellow ship lines are container ships. The dry bulk carriers are shown in blue, oil and fuel tankers are in red, and the gas carriers, gasoline, natural gas, would be in green. And the ships that transport vehicles are in purple. And the reason it's mesmerizing, one can read so much into it. So it's really easy to spot certain hubs of the global economy with this map. So if you look by continental United States, the red lines above, in the sense, right around these areas. So by Texas and Louisiana, they are tracing liquid fuels, crude oil or gasoline, because Texas and Louisiana are hydrocarbon hubs. And these red thick lines streaming out of the Valdez terminal in Alaska, I'm going to point again right there, because that is the southern end of the Alaskan pipeline. You can read so much into these maps. Obviously, Amazon containers, and they would have been in the yellow, would be included here. And it made me wonder, can you imagine if the Suez Canal didn't exist? And I read in the newspaper, apparently there might be a delay in shipping of Christmas trees and holiday gifts and who knows what else. Give a real different meaning to the spirit of giving, doesn't it? But I doubt the real spirit of giving has anything to do with gifts that show up through Amazon. But back to this site, I really, if you are looking for a new site to see, I humbly suggest shipmap.org. So what looks like dots on this map, This is a screenshot, but the actual side, these dots move because they're real ships being trapped. So you watch commerce, and these ships are industrious as ants. They move across the screen. So I'm going to point, this was so much fun for me. I need to get a life. But look, by Florida, all the cruise ships parked up there, lit up right there. And if you look carefully, look at all the pipelines that are going from the Persian Gulf down around India, all the way through the Straits of Malacca, because those are the shipping channels they're the hubs of China's crude oil that they need. And what's interesting, I'm going to point again, this is the coast of Somalia. You see so many ships in the Persian Gulf, but not too many along the coast of Somalia. And that's telling. The reason is in the 2010s, around that area, this region was in the news for the Somali pirates. Cargo ships were held for ransom, and the Somali pirates had hijacked about 49 ships in 2009. The number had gone up to about 47 in 2010. And in 2011, pirates had launched a record number of attacks, about 176, but then commandeered only 25 of them. 25 is big enough, but that indicated that the new onboard defense systems on the cargo ships were working. But the entire story is never that simple, is it? So some of the pirates along the central Somalia's Indian Ocean coastline said that they never wanted the region to become a pirate den. And according to them, piracy began around 2005 as a way to keep the international vessels from plundering fish stocks off Somalia. Because many of the original pirates, or before they became pirates, they were fishermen. And due to the international trawlers, fish had dwindled, and these people had to earn a living, and in desperation turned to piracy. And piracy became very lucrative, and then the Italian mafia got involved. And what was interesting to me as I researched was that in those pirate heydays in Somalia, the ISIS group couldn't enter because those areas in Sudan and Somalia are very associated with ISIS and terrorism. But isn't it interesting? As long as that there's wealth, no one is busy trying to become a martyr if you have a life of pleasure. Why would you give up a life of pleasure? I found that very interesting. It's different now, but during those times, they made sure no ISIS showed up. Everything was blocked out. And so now with added security on ships nowadays, there are very few cases of piracy. But yet, if you go back to that map ahead, you will see there are very, very little ship channel travelings around the Somali coast there. So if we go back a few decades about waters and boats, we come to the time of World War II, and in this case, U-boats. These dominated our history. By the end of the war, Hitler's Kriegsmarine, I think I might have pronounced it correctly, I never know, it's the Nazi Germany Navy, had built about 1,100 U-boats, or maybe 1,160 something. And the U-boats are short for the German term of Unterseeboot. I think I said it correctly, effectively undersea boat. So the U-boat was not a true submarine in today's sense. It's more a submersible craft that had to surface every few hours when air and battery power were exhausted. So decades prior to World War II, in the World War II, in the World War I area, Woodrow Wilson's US Emergency Fleet Corporation had begun to build hundreds of ships to combat the destructive German U-boats that were sinking merchant and passenger ships in the Atlantic. Plagued by mechanical and construction issues, none of these ships actually made it to the European war. And so most of them were moved along the Potomac to be salvaged by a local company and then just abandoned in this shipwreck, I don't know, funeral parlor. You can see them. It's in Maryland. But man's appetite for control over others has a long history over actually everything, practically. And in this painting by Turner, the 19th century steamboat, what Turner is depicting is he's symbolizing the end of an era by his setting sun and this modern little tugboat pulling this masted, I don't know, lovely, impressive sailing ship. But it is the iron steamships that have changed history. So China had no steam power in 1839, so in the mid 19th century. That's when the first Opium Wars with Great Britain had begun. And Great Britain had used its early steam-powered gunboats. If you look on the bottom right, I'm going to point. Here are the steam-powered gunboats for their lopsided victory over the Chinese. 17 years later, China had yet to take the first step to creating a steam navy of her own. Well, they've definitely caught up by now. And because they hadn't gotten steamboats by then, they had another devastating defeat years later in the Second Opium War. And the Opium Wars were, in all actuality, trade wars. European powers were carving up territories to capture wealth through natural resources like timber and tea, all of those areas, tea especially. The creation of the British Hong Kong was a result of this maritime trade and trade wars. And if you go further back from the Opium War, so we're just tunneling into history, this little cartoon, I just loved it, is representing 18th century and the 7-year war. And these strategies that affected land even across the Atlantic in the United States, because this 7-year war involved France and all the great powers of Europe. Now to 16th century, the Spanish Armada, so that's Philip II, and he certainly didn't like his ex-half sister-in-law, Elizabeth I. And plus he had that pesky religious issue, Catholic Spain, Catholic France versus Protestants and the Church of England. And back then, the Netherlands was part of Spanish Empire. And so Netherlands, as we know now, the Dutch lands that we see now wasn't anything like it was defined back then. And England yet wasn't a powerhouse. So what Philip wanted to do was establish Catholicism in England. He did not like what Henry had tried, but that didn't really work out well for Philip, because the smaller, I'm going to point now, so you see this, it's written, you can see upside down, the Spanish fleet and the English fleet. The English fleet were nimble, though they were small, and they could get into the formation of the Spanish fleet because they were nimble. And the Spanish fleet were waiting for help from the Duke of Parma, who was the Spanish region in the Netherlands, but he hadn't arrived on time. And so history played out on water. And Francis Drake, I guess you would call him Sir by soon, he was part of this fleet that was part of the one that defeated the Armada, although he was not one in command, he was second in command. But it was the storms that gave English an advantage, because inclement weather in the English Channel and on the oceans have always been cited as a major factor to the outcome, the win for England. So the Spanish defeat put England on the map. And even if initially undeserved, her famed prowess put the English Navy in great demand through the rest of the world, because news like this travel fast to the colonies, almost as fast, not even almost, definitely as fast to the Spice Islands by Indonesia, because everybody wanted to align with the powers that be, because might was right back then, and probably sometimes now as well. And since we know the future, because we're tunneling backwards, this win of the Spanish Armada, over the Spanish Armada by England, in the future 17th and 20th through the 20th century, the memory of this victory was evoked both during the Napoleonic Wars and the Second World War, when Britain again faced a substantial danger of foreign invasion. And these commemorative medals bear variations of the inscription. So you're going to start from here, 1588, and read clockwise. It's saying in Latin, and I think the word is written, I couldn't make it out, but it said it was written in Hebrew, the word of God. It said, he blew with his winds and they were scattered. So what it is saying is that the wind had scattered the Armada, and then they called this wind the Protestant wind because it favored the Protestants. So obviously God had a hand in everything. And so it was called the Protestant wind. And incidentally, storms have played a part in altering history in other cases as well. The notable one for me is that it helped keep the Mongols out of Japan, because the Mongols had swept through Asia, all the way through China, decimated the culture there, went into North Korea, all those areas. I mean, they had tried to cross and to arrive in Japan. It was the stormy seas that had kept them out, and they just said, okay, forget it, we have a lot of other lands to go over. Can you imagine if the Mongols had sacked 12th, 13th century Japan? All that beauty of the Heian courts would have been lost to us. All that literature, all that art, gone forever. Ah. So a powerful empire before the English were the Portuguese, a very powerful maritime power. And shown here are the principal forts, trading posts, and colonies of the Portuguese Empire. The Dutch colonial empire had lasted for over 3.5 centuries. That's quite an impressive number. And they were both in the East and the West hemispheres of the globe. The majority of the Dutch Empire, that economy was concentrated on the East Indies, because these Straits of Malacca, all these Java, Indonesia, Malaysia, all those areas were the lucrative spice trades. And the Dutch East India Company, VOC, is believed to be the largest chartered company to ever have existed in recorded history. And they did massive trade with Mughal India, trades in textiles and silk. And these trades made a very, very wealthy Dutch empire. And wealth helps flourish the arts. And that is why one sees Dutch artists like Rembrandt appear during those times, because they could be commissioned and they had patrons. Here is an example of Rembrandt's drawing off the Mughal courts. And he drew what he imagined India to be, since he had never visited India. And so the influence of the Dutch also shows up in the Mughal court paintings during the times of Emperor Jahangir. I'll be happy to show them in some other presentation. So created from newly digitized logbooks of European ships, this map is showing British, Dutch, and Spanish shipping routes from 1750 to about 1800s. So it's effectively a flattening of the world. The French trade data hadn't been available then. And here is one of the most powerful empires before English started their ascendancy. Spain had a very successful, lucrative trade route with the Americas. So it went both ways. They also had a very successful Spanish galleon, which involved the Philippines. So they traveled, they were lucrative trades, both East and West. The trades with the Philippines, and it's telling because the island Philippines is named after Spanish King Philip. And it was under their control. It was under Spanish controls for centuries, until Philippines became a US territory around 1898 and remained a territory there till like 1938, right around the World War II times. In this picture, a diver is inspecting wooden crates on a 17th century Spanish shipwreck that was discovered off Panama. So gold and silver mines in South and Central America fed the ambitions and coffers of Spain's royal family. They got their wealth from the Americas. And to transport the wealth of the New World to Europe, Spanish colonists built fleets of merchant vessels that were escorted by armed galleons and warships. And many of these ships are the ones that Francis Drake attacked before, he was effectively a pirate, till he was deemed sir. And he still kept his piracy habits with himself, except he was knighted now. So the silver from Bolivia enriched Spain, but mining had a very high mortality. And so Spain brought African slave labor for the mines in Bolivia. And that's why you see that reflected in the composition of South American countries, in Brazil and places like that. After delivering their treasures to Spain, the fleets would turn around laden with European goods and hopscotch through the Spanish colonies, selling their cargo. This shipwreck outline, I'm sure you can understand here, it's a very faint outline. The rest of it was a bunch of data, so I cut it out. I don't think I did an elegant job, but it does the job. So the shipwreck outline is of the Spanish merchant ship Encarnacion, and it sunk around 1681 near the Caribbean side of the Panama. It was built in Veracruz, Mexico, because all this data was available in the archive. And the cargo vessel was part of the Tierra Firme fleet, which was the economic lifeline of 17th century Spain. And wealth again produces art. El Greco's view of Toledo. So his name itself, El Greco, the Greek, signifies an outsider in Spain, in Spanish Empire. That's why you can refer to him as the Greek, not too many there. And so it was the wealth of Spain that drew artists from outside her empire because they would find patronage. So just for fun, please note the proximity of the church and the palace in the painting, because the actual buildings were much farther apart. So what El Greco was doing, he was symbolically equating the power of the church with the king. Religion often takes primacy, and it is religion or the religious sentiments that abolished slavery in England, and it made it illegal in most, but not all parts of the British territories of the empire. So the sea, again, was a conduit for slavery. This is how the sea impacts our history and makes us who we are. The international slave trade supplied much of the labor force during the colonial era and the domestic trade in the 19th century. It's really something. Look at the vastness of the British Empire. Hats off. I mean, there's something there. Abolishing slavery may have felt morally right, but the affairs of the empire needed to run efficiently. So who would do all the work in the plantations? The sugar plantations, the tea plantations, the rubber plantations. That was the business end of the empire. You know, the Kew Gardens, beautiful as they are, they were an economic arm of British Empire. All the pretty plants, they also had a business end to it. And so the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 was a marking point. That is when a system of indenture, which is debt bondage, and you had indentured servants in America, but that's when it was implemented throughout the British Empire. And 2 million Indians, called coolies, were transported from India to various colonies of European power to work mainly on sugar plantations. So the Indian indenture was banned in 1917 due to pressure from Indian nationalists and because it was declining in terms of profit. So it wasn't stopped because of any humanitarian reasons. But here are examples. This is one of the indenture is one of the reasons there's a large Indian diaspora worldwide. As I like to jokingly say, I see my peeps everywhere. Wherever I go, I see them. So for example, the Black Africans refused to work in Natal. And so Indians were brought in to work in South Africa, fresh off the boat, so to speak, and effects of which can be felt and seen even now. For example, in the Masters Championship in Augusta National golf courses, Vijay Singh of Fijian heritage. Another one is Farooq Bulsara. He was born pre-independence India to parents who had moved to British-controlled Zanzibar. Farooq is part of the other queen from England. You know him as Freddie Mercury. That thunderbolts and lightnings are indeed, that song from Queen is very appropriate for a story on water. And it is a very odd coincidence. I love when I find these odd things. This is actually today's Bing homepage. So if you go to bing.com, this is the picture that's going to greet you. Look at what it says, Bohemian Switzerland. And if you look down, this is what it said on there. Is this the real leaf? Is this just fantasy? I know I really need to get a life, but I purred with delight when I read that. I want to know who creates this page. Hopefully not artificial intelligence, because anybody who's not familiar with Queen, this is part of a very, very famous song from that band. The song was called Bohemian Rhapsody, and it has those lines, which they cleverly muted it to leaf. It actually says, is this the real life? Is this a fantasy? Caught in a landslide, no escape from reality. Open your eyes, look up to the sky and see. It's a great song. So anyway, I just want to show that it was just a very odd coincidence. Back to the story on REIGN, R-E-I-G-N. So migration within the British Empire, and all these migrations were ship journeys. That's why they're included in this narration. Ship journeys for the indentured servants and others who were not indentured servants but traveled within the British Empire. For example, here Gandhi, who was definitely not an indentured servant, had moved to South Africa for work. He is shown here with his secretary, Sonia Schlesien, because he practiced law in Johannesburg. Trinidad is the story of indentured laborers from India. Almost 42% of Trinidad and Tobago's population are either full or partial Indian descent. So Indians came to Trinidad and Tobago as indentured laborers to work on the sugar plantations after the abolishment of slavery in England in 1833. So the Indian laborers were bonded under a contract for about 5 years or more to work as short-term migrant laborers on these plantations under British or French. And their passage to the Caribbean was usually paid by the employer. And on completion, they could return to India at the expense of their employer or settle in these new homelands. But in reality, these conditions of work were oppressive, the wages were paltry, and the agreements were rarely honored. Famines, destruction of indigenous industry, and underemployment under colonial rule had left large chunks of the population of India without food and basic amenities. So these men and women wanted to escape, and the British offered them indentureship as a chance to flee to the proverbial greener pastures. Their descendants, though, have done well. They have been prime ministers in Trinidad and Tobago of both male and female of Indian heritage. Shown here is the prime minister. I want to just show her in their diverse attires. And another one from that region who might be more familiar to you or definitely to your children is Nicki Minaj, a megastar of today's age, and she's sitting next to Anna Wintour. So she's doing well. So reign again means to rule. So how does water rule economically and thereby also politically? My view is by controlling the labor markets. To know water through labor. So migration and economic and geopolitical transformation that is happening on the waterways. So what is the cause and effects of these tides of change? So the observations that hopefully we'll make about our modern age, globalization, may be extrapolated from this overview of the British Empire. Because due to the monsoons and the cyclones, water is a barrier and a carrier for economy through labor. So let's start with the eastern side. The ports of Calcutta, shown on the map, but mainly Madras Presidency on the eastern side of India. These were the emigration and immigration points for the circular migration in the Bay of Bengal. So 3 to maybe 7 year stints to places like Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, Burma, which is now Myanmar, and Malaya, which is now Malaysia. So Tamil Hindus and Muslims, so Tamil Indians of all different kinds of religion, went to work in the rubber plantations in Malaya and the rice fields of Burma. Numbers in 1926 documents, these are staggering numbers who went. And this is a circular migration. So they used to go and come back, do 2-3 stints and come back and earn money and keep going back and forth. So 150,000 workers went to Malaya, 275,000 workers went to Ceylon, and 400,000 workers went to Burma per year. And these were all backed by Indian capital, money lenders from areas in South India. So there was profit making going all the way through. And the Indian migrants worked in every sector of the economies in those British places. So the Bay of Bengal was at the heart of the imperial economy. So steamship technology made ocean crossing cheap and fast. And that body of water is defined by mobility of both people and capital. That's why it's labor, economies through labor. Because to me, it is a very human sea. How does the fluidity of this kind of migration over water transform our world? That is what I want to discover in this presentation, or I think I have discovered. So when Tamil Muslims moved from India to other regions to work for a few years, they brought along with them their habits and their beliefs, their religious habits, obviously. So this mosque in South India, in Tamil Nadu in India, from where they went, you will see it later, as you can see it now. Here it is represented in Singapore. And again, the migrants from Tamil Nadu who went to Penang, they made their mosques. Hindu Tamils who went from Tamil Nadu to Singapore modeled their Hindu temples on it. And this is the one that This is the front end of it. And this is the one that's inspired in Malaysia. So migration to these areas were circular. People came and went every few years. So you have people who are coming from India, China, Sri Lanka, all circulating in this economic vortex. So the Bay of Bengal, and which is just west of the South China Sea, becomes a shared communal space along with all the regions that people are laboring in. So whenever these people who are coming together in whichever region that they're working, they're sharing food stalls, say, for example, in Singapore. So the Chinese are eating Indian food or trying, and the Indians are trying Chinese food and Sri Lankan food. Everything is shared because of this large diaspora. And they also share in their own the festivals. And that is why this temple, an architectural amalgam of different cultures, and I love this, also hosts diverse deities. So within the same temple structure, you have Chinese, Buddhist, Hindu gods, including Ganesh, all under one roof. Because everyone there reveres the divine, all things viewed equally holy. Even the gods must be smiling at this. One might say, Shoma, this is all too Eastern or too alien, but it's really not, because we live in a connected world. What happens at this end is not isolated. The circular migrations affects the world because these Tamil migrants from India made the success of Ford Motor Company possible, because the US was the major consumer of the latex that ultimately made the rubber tires for the US automobile industry. So you can imagine all these Tamil Indians were the ones who made Henry Ford that phenomenally successful, because you can't drive a car without tires. Compared with the Burmese rice cultivation, which is highly seasonal, Malayan rubber tapping provided a regular flow of income and was less arduous. So again, let us investigate the effects of water on economy. And we're going to observe this Bay of Bengal as the human sea to the British Empire, because it is throbbing with migrants and the undulation of the labor market and its ripple effects on the world is what I'm interested in. And hopefully you find interesting as well. So this is the quaint colonial British Empire one expects to see. I am not interested in this one, but I just wanted to show you the picture because a lot of you like this Raj pictures. I want to shift the focus to the aspect that made it so amenable to those who chose to live there in India or even to visit. The secret is, it's obvious, abundant, cheap labor. Look at the difference when in India and in retirement. Retirement outside India looks decidedly less indolent. I would like to be served hand and foot when I retire. I would probably go back to India. So what is captured with extreme good humor is earnestly illustrated here. And it is an indicator of the character of that century. So loads of things wash up symbolically on the beach. Trades, religions, ideas, people, everything comes up. What this is showing is Europeans in complete assurance, there they are, being rowed, welcomed by the natives. So read minority. And the minority work vigorously. Many things could go wrong, so you must be diligent and vigorous. The obvious message is that to make this connection possible, you need lots of labor, minority labor. And then look at the waves. Look at these massive waves, because what that is symbolizing is, here comes the tsunami of Western civilization. Simple painting, priceless in its message. And the Bay of Bengal has been a glorious watery stage of commercial exchange for centuries. Recently, it has become a more human designed area. And by recently, I mean in the last about 200 years for conquest by European powers. So Calcutta was the capital of the British Empire until the capital was shifted to New Delhi in 1931. And full disclosure, Calcutta is my birthplace. I'm from there. But this picture isn't included solely for humor, but it is something to see a zebra pulling a cart. But it is really contributing to the narrative about water, because zebras are indigenous to Africa. They're not from India. So this animal too made the journey across the Bay of Bengal. And as we had learned about navigation of the Indian Ocean during the Roman trades, that the monsoons rained, and that is REIGN, that sentiment held true with anyone associated with India, be they part of the British Empire or our current stakeholders in India now. So that this quote on the bottom by India's president earlier, India's finance minister is the monsoon, is completely an eternal message. Monsoon can ruin crops through flooding or drought, shipwrecks, and they can shipwreck goods and migrants and cause utter destruction on land as on the ships. The British had deforested vast tracts in India with the promise of railroad efficiency for transporting goods and people. Nature proved the empire wrong, or at least rather, she exposed the empire, because famines decimated the Indian population and people died of starvation in the millions. Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp, was scathing in her assessment of British mismanagement. It was to her a criminal neglect, an absolute lack of interest in taking care of the land to feed the people through efficient irrigation. Even back then, the New York Times had published a report that described, and I'm quoting, a state of society in India whose only parallel in recent times was to be found in American slavery. Keep in mind, America had just come out of the Civil War around this time. And so to save face in the global stage, the British Empire started vigorously collecting data, analyze all this, studying the rains to find a pattern to minimize loss. And so in the early 19th century, the British administration in Calcutta had, at the insistence of a Stamford Raffles, his statue shown here, approved annexing Singapore and Penang. These were not yet the places that they have become. And Raffles, Stamford Raffles, had wanted these lands to check Dutch monopoly of that area. So it wasn't that he was interested in the territory. He was more interested, he looked at it from the viewpoint of trade. Well, there, because of they wanted to understand the monsoon better, to address that issue, British sailors, meteorologists, climatologists were dispatched throughout the British colonies on the east to collect data on Indian storms throughout the British ports and colonies. And the term cyclone was termed by the English captain Piddington, based on the Greek term koloma, which means coiled, because cyclones were circular curved winds. And the data was meticulously, dutifully collected. But you see, water doesn't lend itself to be ruled. Try raining the rains. Good luck. So the monsoons came despite years of all the administration and scientific confidence, that stiff upper lip. What happens then? So I'm kind of being partially facetious, throw a party to show that all is well. And so Darbar, which is an Indian term for extravagant gatherings, were held. In fact, multiple ones. The apogee of this would be the Delhi Darbar in 1911. For context, there were massive famines in 1896, 1897, and this is all in India. In 1899, 1900, massive famines going on, deaths in the millions. What perfect timing to have a party. But since you're going to have a party, make it count. King George and Queen Mary came to their treasure chest, that was India, and everyone loves her tiaras and pearl chokers. That really gives you multiple meanings to the term jewel in the crown. And the British administration ensured that all the princely states of India came and paid obeisance. So, but the effects of empire and the watery impermanent migrations are very interesting. Lessons learned then are applicable even today. So the migrants that worked throughout the Far East archipelago, and this area is called the Southeast Asia. So we're going to be viewing climate, monsoon as an index of displacement through these areas now. So for example, in the Malayan rubber plantations of year-round tropicality, so there is no wet or dry season there, unlike the seasonal rice cultivation of Burma. So Malay provided most of the tire of the US automobile, and you could have steady income there without having to go back and forth. So rubber tapping was very good that way, except when your primary buyer is one country, you better hope that country doesn't have any trouble. So when the depression hit the United States, it affected demand. So there was a global depression and people started losing jobs. And these indentured servants would then float through the job circuit, literally float, shipping through water, Malay, Singapore, Burma, which is present day Myanmar, and then they also went to Ceylon. One interesting cultural effect is cosmopolitanism. And this Penelope is entirely put in because I thought of you. The one movie theater in Singapore catering to such a wide diaspora. So at one show, it had only a single screening. At one show, they could be showing a Hollywood movie, and perhaps the next one, they would show a Chinese one. And because then the cinema in Singapore was a polyglot because it was catering to the diaspora that was there. And I'm including this because I realize that the immigration experience allows for self-fashioning through exposure. All this due to easy transit across the Bay of Bengal. And at the same theater, a little later, a film from India, silent film, I guess, during those times. So that would appeal to everyone. They should have showed Mr. Bean. They would have appealed to everyone. And I know this is Indian because you see the Tamil script down there. That's the only way I know what this movie is about. And insular when compared to the other Southeast Asian countries, the Burmese were also largely unfamiliar with finance and international trade. So they distrusted British educational and cultural institutions and the large number of migrant Indian workers from British-controlled India that landed up in Myanmar. So the capital of Myanmar, then Rangoon, the population was 70% Indian because of the job migrations that came. And in 1916, when the Indian poet Tagore visited Rangoon, he had remarked, and I'm going to read them, quote, "The city of Rangoon is not a city of Burma. It appears to stand in opposition to the entire country. The city has not grown like a tree from the soil of the country," close quotes. And so this is rather prophetic because very soon in the 1930s and World War II, there were deep intercommunal violence. And so in these times, with Japan's involvement in World War II, in this Eastern theater of war, Indians of Burma, because they were part of the British Empire, were under duress. And when they tried to escape, the British Governor General blocked them because he feared that the lack of a workforce would paralyze the British defense of Burma. And so nearly 500,000 Indians walked across some of the harshest tropics of Asia in order to escape the Japanese army, because all the shipping trades were stopped then because it's wartime. And the influx of refugees, the loss of food supplies from Burma, and the newfound focus of Japanese bombers became one of the biggest causes of the Bengal famine in 1943. Death in the millions dying on the street. And Bengal is a rice growing state and had provided supplies for the British in World War II. And a large portion of the British Army, both in World War I and World War II, were Indian. They supplied, again, the labor. And at the peak of the famine, here are the interesting things, or saddening things. The rain levels were above average. So it's not like the crops didn't yield. Churchill's war cabinet in London was warned repeatedly by the British that the exhaustive use of Indian resources for the war effort could result in famine. Churchill opted to continue exporting rice from India to elsewhere in the empire. And that is why one of the first actions of a newly independent India in 1947 was to build dams, to control the monsoons, to control the water so as to achieve food security. because the trauma of famine, of millions of people dying, that's not easy to forget, and nor should one forget that. And so the first dam, Bakra Nangal, was constructed. And here is the prime minister, the man in resplendent white in the middle, the first prime minister of independent India, Jawaharlal Nehru. And he had declared that these dams, these are the temples of new India where I worship. So effectively saying, I bring in modernity to make India a successful country, service to the people. It's admirable concept. But since then, India and China and nations in that region have been on a dam building spree. And so, for example, this one that was recently completed, the Tehri Dam up in the foothills of the Himalaya, it manages the Himalayan glacial water flow that actually form the rivers of India, the Ganges being one of them. And here is the Gangetic Plain flowing down into the Bay of Bengal area. Down here in the Gangetic Plains, which is the control of the water and the silt, that is what is very important. When you're controlling the flow of water, which brings in the silt that makes all these rice-growing paddy fields, the deltas of Bengal, very, very fertile. It is problematic because it has unexpected consequences, and it begs telling that hundreds of dams is scheduled to be built, some already commenced, in these ecologically sensitive areas that will impact millions of people. And they were designed without taking into consideration the calculations of climate change and the water melting, because it's melting at an alarming rate. They're designing dams without taking it into account. And so from the waters from the delta and the silt that they carry into the lower plains, so these are all silt area of the Brahmaputra Valley. Consistent silt deposits in the bay sometimes create islands. And when the trees take root, they get a solid footing. But these are contested areas between three countries, India, Bangladesh, Myanmar. So for example, this New Moor Island in Bengali, which is my vernacular, South Talpotty, for nearly 30 years, India and Bangladesh have argued over control of this tiny rock island in the Bay of Bengal. And they took it to the International Court in The Hague. It couldn't be solved. It was still in litigation. Luckily, or ironically, the rising sea level solved the dispute and the island is gone. It's sunk back in the water. And so these water boundaries in post-colonial eras are fraught with problems. One cannot rule the water. Here is where problems might arise. For example, this Buddhist monk, Wirathu, he's in Myanmar. He is the one who has exacerbated the Rohingya refugee problem because he promoted and promotes violence through social media, and his preachings take a very rabid nationalistic fervor. And so Bangladesh, the country next to Myanmar, is the only country that accepted these Rohingya refugees and plans to hold them in this newly formed silt island. And you can watch it forming over the past years. And these tidal channels crisscross the island. This island is called Bhashunchar. Char is like this silt formation. And it makes this island, if you can call it an island, prone to flooding. Coast Guards patrol the area and housing has been made for the refugees. And roughly 64 people to each house where they will share a common, like 2 kitchens and 1 toilet block. And the family houses are grouped in clusters, sharing a cyclone shelter between them. And the funny thing is, who wants to live here? They're going to bring in people who are completely land people who probably don't know how to swim on an island that may not exist in an area that is fraught with exclusive economic zone tensions. And why is it fraught with tensions? Because this area has the possibility of natural gas in that region. In fact, it's the natural resources in these areas of Myanmar that really makes the army and the people push these refugees out, because they were living in areas that are rich resourcefully. And then to top all of this out, these regions are also the critical sea lanes and ports that are part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Can it get any worse? And in fact, it does, because over 80% of China's crude oil imports transits, goes through these areas to the Straits of Malacca. And so it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What exactly will these maps look like when that maritime infrastructure of the Belt and Road Initiative is completed? What will this map look like if the Arctic Passage, which is the Northwest and Northeast Passage up here, starts to melt due to global warming? And then so all these white lines, these shipping lines, you'll start seeing them up here. Many of us may think of that in horror. There are shipping companies that are waiting for this boom to happen because it'll save them money. So the entire top area will light up. And really, what will happen when more than 2 billion people are at the mercy of these Himalayan ice caps, when they start melting ever so rapidly, after the initial flooding of these ice melts, and the floodings will happen in Nepal, Bhutan, India, China, Vietnam, Burma, Cambodia, Pakistan, all these areas. What will be the global response to the following droughts? Will the world ocean become the human sea that was the Bay of Bengal during the British Empire? Because you'll have mass environmental crisis of refugees. One doesn't know, but the reality is the future is created by us every day, by the actions we take. And I have deep faith in humanity. And so the final issue on this series on water, which is going to be about glacial melting across the planet, its title Formless, is on December 16th, Thursday again at 1:30. I hope you consider joining us. And as always, I wish you joy, but especially this week, and to you, Jack, as well, and those who have come from outside Israel, and I think there might be someone from France also. Happy Thanksgiving, in the sense I'm very grateful that I get to share these times with you because you fill me with joy. Please have a good afternoon or good evening, wherever you might be. I'm going to stop sharing now.